Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskind Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Malthrop. I'm the Chief Executive here. I'm also a proud member of our City Club. We're here at the end of Mental Health Awareness Month, so it's appropriate and also a pleasure to introduce our speaker today, author and mental health advocate, Pete Earley. Currently, in our nation, the largest mental health facility isn't a state-of-the-art hospital or recovery center. It's the Cook County Jail in Illinois, where an estimated 1 in 3 inmates battle some form of mental illness. Rikers Island in New York and Los Angeles County Jail follow close behind Cook County in the number of inmates with mental illness. Those correctional institutions are sadly not unique. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI as it's known, estimates at least 400,000 inmates currently behind bars in the United States suffer from some form of mental illness. They also estimate that 25 to 40% of all Americans with mental illness will be jailed or incarcerated at some point in their lives. That's up to 2 in 5 Americans with mental illness who will cross paths with the criminal justice system. So what does that look like, crossing paths with the criminal justice system? Inmates often spend weeks, months, and in rare cases even years in jails, waiting to be transferred to state mental hospitals where experts will determine whether they are well enough to stand trial. Sometimes this process ends tragically, as in the case of J. Michael Mitchell, a 24-year-old suffering from schizophrenia, who died in a Virginia prison recently, and our speaker today recently wrote about that. Mitchell had been charged with stealing just $5 worth of snacks from a store. Pete Earley has a personal connection to this intersection of mental health and our nation's justice systems. Mr. Earley's son, Michael, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and during a manic episode committed a crime. The ensuing experience is chronicled in Mr. Earley's book, Crazy, A Father's Search Through America's Mental Health Madness, which was a 2007 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. The book has also won awards from every major mental health organization in the United States, including the American Psychiatric Association. Mr. Earley spent much of his career in journalism, beginning as a reporter in Kansas before heading to Washington, D.C. in 1978 as the lone and probably lonely correspondent for the Tulsa Tribune, covering the Oklahoma congressional delegation and, on occasion, the White House and the U.S. Supreme Court. He later served as a reporter for the Washington Post. He's also the author of 12 nonfiction books, including 4 New York Times bestsellers, along with 6 novels. Today, Mr. Earley spends much of his time doing mental health advocacy work, traveling the country and around the world in support of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. He's testified or appeared before the U.S. Congress 5 times to tell his story and advocate for changes in our mental health care system. After the Virginia Tech shooting tragedy in 2007, Mr. Earley was appointed by the Chief Justice of the Virginia Supreme Court to a panel that rewrote the state's mental health laws. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Pete Earley.
Thank you very much. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. Thank you so much. The history of your club, this is such an honor for me, and I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you, Dan, for that very generous introduction. I've been asked today to tell you a little about my story. And my story begins with a frantic car ride and my son, college-age son, saying these words, "Dad, how would you feel if someone you loved killed himself?" My college-age son, who's Michael in the book, and his real name is Kevin, Michael was his middle name, and I were racing from New York City, where he was a student, to Fairfax County, Virginia, outside Washington, D.C., when he asked me that question. My son had been diagnosed a year earlier with mental illness, bipolar disorder, and a doctor had put him on medication. But my son had stopped taking his pills. And when I picked him up that morning in Manhattan, he had been wandering around the city for 5 days. He hadn't slept. He was convinced that God had him on a special mission. And during that frantic car ride, he would laugh 1 minute, and then he'd begin sobbing the next. And I pleaded with him to take his medication. He screamed, "Pills are poison! Leave me alone!" And we got to the emergency room at Fairfax Hospital, and the nurse rolled her eyes while Kevin was talking gibberish about how God had him on this special mission. And then we were taken into a room all alone, away from everyone else. And we were there for 4 hours. And finally, my son said, "I'm not sick. There's nothing wrong with me. I don't need to be in here. I'm going to leave." And I said, hang on. And I literally went out and I grabbed a doctor. And I will never forget how that doctor came in the room. He came in with his hands up as if he was surrendering. He said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Earley. I really can't help you with your son." I said, "You haven't even examined him." And he explained that it didn't matter. Virginia law at that time was very specific. Unless a person posed an immediate, imminent danger, they could not be required to take medication. They could not be required to undergo treatment. And the nurse had told him my son thought all pills were poison. But he looked at me and he said, "You seem like a nice guy. I'll tell you what. You bring your son back after he tries to kill you or kill someone else." Well, I took my son home, and during the next 48 hours, I saw him sink deeper and deeper into a mental abyss. At one point, he had tin foil wrapped around his head because he didn't want the CIA reading his thoughts through our television. He slipped out of the house. He slipped out early one morning. He slipped out. He broke into a stranger's house. He broke in to take a bubble bath. Luckily, no one was there. It took 5 police officers to get him out. And when they did, they took him over to a mental health center, and they called me, and I went racing over there, and a policeman was standing outside. And he said, whoa, Mr. Earley, before you go in there, let me give you a little father-to-father advice. Even though your son has told us he has bipolar disorder, even though he's told us he's off his medication, even though we picked him up in a house taking a bubble bath, unless you go in and you tell that psychiatrist your son has threatened to kill you, he will not meet the imminent danger criteria, and we will take him to jail, and you don't want that. And I looked at him and I said, "My son hasn't threatened to kill me." And he shrugged and he walked away. So I'm here today to tell you, and I do it with no pride because it hurt my relationship with my son. I went in and I lied. I said my son had threatened to kill me, and that was good enough to get him taken to a hospital where 24 hours later he voluntarily committed himself. But our problems were far from over. 24 hours after my son was admitted in that hospital, I got a call from his doctor. He said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Earley, your insurance company is not going to pay for this. They say he doesn't need to be here. We're going to release him." I said, hold on. I called that insurance company, and I got absolutely nowhere. Until I happened to mention that I used to work at the Washington Post. And I happened to mention that I was friends with Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes, and they should expect a call. And can you imagine getting that call? "Hi, this is Mike Wallace with 60 Minutes. Why is Pete Earley, son, being released?" All of a sudden, my son was allowed to stay for a record-breaking 14 days. In between the short time that frantic car ride and my son's hospitalization, I had lied to get him into treatment. I violated my ethics as a journalist because you're not supposed to bully people. And just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. I got a call from the Fairfax County Police. My son was being charged with 2 felonies, breaking and entering and destruction of property. I was so frustrated. I said to my wife, Patty, one night, "I want to help our son, but I don't know how to do it." And she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you do what you do best? Pete Earley, a father, can't figure out much. But Pete Earley, a reporter, can. Why don't you investigate this and see what's really happening?" Well, for once, I actually took my wife's advice. Now, that's my only joke. So if you don't get it, I'm sorry. But I did a little digging, and I discovered what happened to my son is not some aberration. As Dan has just told you, as we're sitting here in this beautiful facility, there are 400,000 people with schizophrenia and major depression and bipolar disorder in our jails and prisons. More than 2 million are arrested every year. More than 1 million are on probation. And as Dan said, the largest public mental facility in the United States today is not a treatment center. It's the rivalry between the Cook County Jail, Rikers Island, and the LA County Jail. And if you think Ohio has missed out on this, then you need to think again. Despite all you've done, and I want to tell you right now, Ohio has been a national leader when it comes to mental health reform. You should pat yourself on the back. But despite everything you have done, there are nearly 5 times as many individuals with mental illness in your jails and prisons than there are in your treatment facility. 5 times. 1 in 12 prisoners in your state have a serious and persistent mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, according to a recent story in the Columbus Dispatch. And a study found that if you live in Ohio and your son, like mine, has a breakdown like my son did, the chances are 4-to-1 they'll end up in jail or prison rather than getting any kind of help. 4-to-1. Well, statistics like that gave me an idea. I thought I'd go and find a jail somewhere and follow the people through the jail out in the streets, and then go back and talk to all the experts and the correctional officers and the parents and try to make sense of it. Well, I started in Los Angeles. Makes sense. At the time, it was the largest public mental facility. I lasted 2 days before they kicked me out, saying I was violating HIPAA. I tried Cook County next. This was before Sheriff Dart, and they said no. I tried Rikers Island next, and they said no. I tried Baltimore next. They said no. I tried Washington, D.C., my hometown, and they said, hell no. And I ended up going to Miami because of a really forward-thinking judge down there, Judge Steve Leifman, who said, I want you to see what's happening in our jail. I want to take you there. I want to take you onto what's called the forgotten floor. It's the suicide wing. There were 19 cells. It was a U-shaped cell block. The officers walked up and down the center. The cells all had plexiglass fronts. And when I walked in, I saw men completely naked in those cells. Cells built for 2 people, 5 and 6 people, crowded in there. And because of a design flaw, the cold air was blocked by the plexiglass. The cells were bone-chilling cold, but there were no blankets. And because the jail was old, its water broke down, people on medication were thirsty, but there was no way for them to drink, so they actually drank out of the toilets. And when you listened, you heard the normal jail sounds. But when you listened closer, you could hear the asylum sounds, a person screaming at some unseen tormentor. And then I heard a thud, 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 and then faster, thud, thud, thud. Then louder, thud, thud, thud. It was one of the inmates running forward, smashing his forehead in the front of the cell. I ain't crazy, he said. Well, then quit acting like you are, the unconcerned officer called back. Now, you're going, well, we don't live in Miami, and those people got arrested. There's a reason they got arrested. Dan mentioned Jamel Mitchell. All right, let's talk about him for a second. Arrested last August in my home state, Virginia, in Portsmouth, Virginia. He was so psychotic, 24-year-old African-American, so psychotic that the judge said, you need to go to the state hospital and you get to be made competent to stand trial. Well, what happened? Well, the court either forgot to send the papers, and when they finally got around to sending them, they weren't discovered until 6 days after Mitchell was dead. Jamel Mitchell had been waiting in the Virginia jail for 101 days to be sent to that hospital. He had lost 50 pounds. He died from a heart attack brought on by starvation. And according to news reports, jail officials had refused to feed him because he was not obeying their rules. He was dragged, sprayed with mace, beaten by jail officials, verbally abused, laughed at, mocked, stood on, and treated like a circus animal, according to news reports. And what was his crime? Dan already told you. I'll go into detail. He was psychotic. He wandered in a store. He was hungry. He picked up $5 worth of snack foods, a Mountain Dew, Snickers bar, and zebra cake, and he walked out without paying it. And for that, he died. Now, he was typical. We're not talking about Hannibal Lecter serial killers here. We're talking about people who have serious mental illnesses. Now, there are many reasons. We don't have time to go into them, all the reasons why our jails and prisons are our new asylums. But the biggest reason is that we still don't have adequately financed community mental health services in our nation, especially crisis care beds. We closed down state hospitals without building a community safety net. And in the aftermath of the 2008 recessions, states cut more than $4 billion in public mental health funding from a system that already was cut to the bone. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, which I belong to, reports that Ohio's public mental health system is currently only serving 22% of adults who have been diagnosed and live with serious mental illness. Only 1 in 5 are getting help. Did you know across America today, in half of our counties in our country, there is no psychiatrist, there is no psychologist, there is no therapist, there is no social worker. There is no treatment in half of our counties across America. Well, because our mental health system is failing us, we're now turning to the criminal justice system to save us. And this is where your state has been a champion and a leader. We have instituted crisis intervention team training for police officers so that we don't have Rambo coming through the door. And that is fantastic. Because of my friend Justice Eve Stratton, Ohio has been a leader in mental health courts. Yes. And veterans courts. Because of my friend Fred Fries, they've been a leader in peer programs and listening to persons with lived experience. Because of my friend Mark Munitz, you have the sequential intercept model, which is brilliant. It designs where in the criminal justice system you can find someone and get them into treatment. And that, right now, Judge Stratton is leading the Stepping Up campaign, which is a national effort to reduce people in jails and prisons who have mental illnesses. But now I'm going to challenge you, because Ohio needs to take the next step forward. You need to go beyond trying to fix the criminal justice system. You have to realize that a diversion system is great, but only if you have somewhere to divert people to. The criminal justice system did not create this crisis, and we can't expect it to solve this crisis. Let's use some common sense. If I had a broken arm, I wouldn't call up your police chief and say, hey, can you come over and fix my arm? And if I needed heart surgery, I wouldn't call up your sheriff and say, hey, can you come put a new heart in? And if I had nasty, nasty hemorrhoids, I wouldn't call up your judge and say, hey, judge, come on over. I need you to take a look. So why are we expecting the police and the sheriff and the judges to fix what is a community problem? The best way to stop the criminalization of persons with mental illness is to interact and get them help before they ever end up in the criminal justice system. And to do that, we need to wake up. And you need to understand that you can't fix, you can't reform the mental health system in our country unless you want to talk about housing. How can you get better if you're living under a bridge? And you can't fix it unless you want to talk about drug and alcohol and co-occurring problems which happen to persons with mental illness. And you can't fix it unless you want to talk about access to good medical care that includes peer support and treatment for trauma. And you can't fix it unless you want to talk about jobs which empower people and give them hope, and clubhouses where they can socialize and be connected to the community. And you can't talk about it unless you want to talk about transportation. You can't talk about it unless you want to talk about veterans. And you can't talk about it unless you want to do the number one thing that you have to have in your community, and that's called giving people hope, telling them they can recover and they can get better. Writer Hal Lindsey said it best: man can live about 40 days without food, about 3 days without water, about 8 minutes without air, but only 1 second without hope. You know, people say to me all the time, oh, people with mental illness, oh, it's just so sad. I feel so sorry for them. And I always reply with one word: bull. And I cut that short out of respect to this audience and this hallowed hall. People get better. Mental illness has one of the highest recovery rates of any illness out. I could tell you about Rick down in Cincinnati, homeless for years, brought in Housing First, an ACT team, a assertive community treatment team that actually went to him and provided services instead of expecting him to get on a bus and try to find a doctor here and there. He's doing great. But today, I'm going to tell you about my son. For 2 years, he's on probation. He did fantastic. As soon as that probation ended, he stopped taking his medication. Now, I could tell he was slipping. So I called the Fairfax County Mobile Response Team. I said, please come, please come. My son's off his med. He needs help. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Is he dangerous? No, he's not dangerous, but let me tell you what happened. You can't judge him on what happened last night. You call him if he's dangerous. Well, the night I didn't have to lie, the night my son was violent, I called that same dispatcher. I said, my son's violent. Will you please come? And he said, whoa, wait a minute. Is he dangerous or is he violent? And I said, he's violent. He said, oh, we don't come if they're violent. You call the police. Well, I called the police, and they came, and they shot my son twice with a taser, and they hogtied him and took him away. Do you know what it's like for a parent to see your son tasered and hogtied and taken away? Now, I'm telling you that story for a reason. If I couldn't get help after writing a book about it, my fancy connections with Mike Wallace, my education, what chance does someone who's homeless, who's psychotic, who doesn't have any connections, what chance do they have? Well, my son got better. 2 more years go by, and then he goes off his meds again. It's Thanksgiving, and he can tell that I know. So he runs out and he jumps in his car and he takes off, and I call him and I say, "What are you doing? What are you doing? Please, please come home." And he says, "I'm going to heaven." And he hangs up the phone. 4 hours later, he ran out of gas. I guess if you live in North Carolina, you're going to be honored because that was where he stopped. That must be heaven. And he called me. I said, "No problem. Just go get some gas. Just go get some gas and we'll take care of this." And he goes, No, you don't understand, Dad. If I step out of this car, I'm going to die. The voices are telling me if I step out of this car, I'm going to die. Now, we all know that's foolish, but how do you know you're listening to me? And if voices in your head were right now saying you'd die if you stepped out of the city club, Dan, you'd have to open up a big wing of beds. So I did what no father should do. I arranged for my son to get gasoline. He drove psychotic up 95, went off the road twice. Luckily, didn't get stopped. Came to my house. I said, "I want to help you. I want to be your partner. What do you want?" "I want to go in a safe house. Just let me go. I don't want to take my meds." Okay, so we go in the safe house. Middle of the night, he gets up, takes off all his clothes, because as everybody knows, when you take off your clothes, you're invisible. And he went walking outside. But listen to what happened to my son this time. This time, a CIT-trained officer picked him up, and that officer treated him with respect. And when my son, he said, "Let's go to a hospital." And my son said, "Don't handcuff me. I'm not a criminal. Don't handcuff me." He said, "I won't. I'll use my discretion." Put him in the back seat. He even said, "What kind of music you like to listen to?" My son said, "Rap." He turned on rap and drove him to the hospital. My son said, "Thank you. That's like a taxi, but you don't have to pay." Got him there. And when that doctor said, "Well, being naked and walking down, that's not dangerous," the officer actually looked at him. "I'm not recommending this." He looked at him and said, "Really, doctor?" Doctor said, "I'm going to drive him over to your front yard and let him out." All of a sudden, my son was admitted. Then he got a case manager, and she said to him, "Why don't you take your medication? Do you know my son's 7 psychiatrists, only 2 have bothered to learn anything about him except his name and his symptoms, and that's because they're only going to be paid for 15 minutes, and all they have to do is stick pills in somebody's mouth and shove them out the door." But treating the mind also requires treating the heart. And she got him a doctor who actually talked to him and said, "Let's work and find a medication that doesn't make you gain 60 pounds and doesn't make you sluggish and doesn't interfere with your life." And then she said, "You shouldn't live with your father." I didn't quite know how to take that, but she said, "You're too old to live with your father." She got him in housing first. She got him with 2 guys with schizophrenia, and he had an apartment, and she said, "I expect you to clean it. I expect you to pay rent on it." And then she said, "What do you want to do with your life?" "Oh, what can I do? I have a mental illness." "Knock it off. Control it. Don't let it control you." I'd like to help people. I got the perfect job for you. It's called peer-to-peer, a person with lived experience, helping people with lived experience. She got him certified. Today, my son is a peer-to-peer specialist. He works on a jail diversion team in Fairfax County. He pays taxes. He lives independently. So don't tell me recovery is not possible. I have seen it with my own eyes. Let me brag a little about my son, a guy over 300 pounds, schizophrenia in the basement of his parents' house, hasn't been out for months. My son gets to know him, talks to him, gets him out. They go to McDonald's, not the best choice, but they go there. That's not much. That's not much unless that is your son. What saved my son? Being diverted from the criminal justice system into the mental health system that actually addressed his needs and gave him hope. What do people with mental illness want? Why do we ask such a stupid question? They want the same thing all of us want. They want a safe place to live, a purpose in life, and people to love them. Which brings me to you. What can you do? Never forget that one person can change the world. One person can change your community. I have seen it happen. Margaret Mead said it best when she said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." You've been very polite, very nice listening to me. I'm going to close by telling you a story. I grew up in Oklahoma. My dad was a minister. That meant that I was dragged to church every Wednesday night, every Saturday, every Sunday. And I got good about sitting there looking like, and never hearing a word, except when he told one story, and it's about a woman having sex. They're in the Bible. You just got to know where to look. A woman is caught in adultery. Notice in the Bible, it's always the women who are caught in adultery. She's dragged into the middle of the city. People gather around. They're going to stone her for this awful thing she's done. And then we read that the teacher says, "Let ye who's never sinned throw that first stone." And they put down the rocks because they all know that they have sinned, that they have committed crimes, whatever, violate whatever. Today we live in a world where people don't put down those rocks. They're anxious to lock up people who are different, get them off the street, just get them out of sight. People with drug addictions and mental illness, just get rid of them. My friend Brian Stephen, who's one of the main characters in one of my first books called Circumstantial Evidence, fabulous attorney, just wrote a book called Just Mercy, which I would recommend. He likes to use the term stone catcher, people who step between the angry mob throwing stones and protect those who can't protect themselves until they're strong enough to join you and protect others. And it's the stone catchers in our society who give me hope. My son has a mental illness. To me, this wears his face. And I'll be forever grateful to people such as Justice Stratton and Fred Fries and Mark Muntz and others who are stone catchers, people like you who can look beyond the madness in his eyes and see a person of worth with parents and family who love him. So thank you for coming today. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for being a stone catcher. Get involved and you will change someone's life. Thank you.
Strong words. Brian Stevenson spoke here.
Oh, did he?
Yes, he did. He did. He spoke here.
I'm
It was.
ashamed because he's the best speaker I've ever heard.
He was really good. He was really good. It was March, what was it, 18th, 19th, 2015, the day after our president spoke. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're enjoying a Friday forum featuring Pete Earley, stonecatcher and mental health advocate and author of Crazy, A Father's Search Through America's Mental Health Madness. Nobody? No, okay. We're about to head into the Q&A, and we welcome questions from all of you, everyone, including guests, City Club members, guests, students, those of you joining us via our radio broadcast, our webcast, or our new live simulcast at the Cuyahoga County Public Library Parma Snow Branch. If you'd like to tweet a question, you can tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. Please make sure your questions are brief and to the point, and actually questions, and please don't try to wrestle the microphone away from our staff. They know just exactly where to hold it. Holding our microphones ably today are our Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky, and our Content Associate, Teddy Eisenberg. May we have our first question, please?
I should say, I know your reputation, and you ask tough questions, and I'm from Washington, so I'm equally tough in giving you a lot of words and not saying anything. So there you go.
I'm fresh from a visit to San Francisco, where the amiable weather and the interesting city makes for a pervasive reality of seeing homeless people. So it's hard not to think about this issue. I risk a technical question. You described your son not being willing to take his meds and the desperate effort to get him to do so, but then you also talked about uncertainty, about what is the right set of medication. From a distance, it's hard not to long for certainty in what should be done for someone. But if you're saying that there's even uncertainty about what drugs someone should take, you begin to throw up your hand again and say, well, then who knows what to do for many people? Do we have to have a great effort put first into examining what a particular individual needs before you know what to do?
And you just hit it on the head. You do have to, no one size fits all. There are some people who do well without medication. There are a vast majority who don't do well without medication. And in that, you need to find the right medication. And, these things take time. They can take years to find the right combination and get the right diagnosis. And the reason is obvious, because we don't have a blood test. I can't, take a DNA sample and say, oh, I have, bipolar disorder. We're not at that stage yet. So it's based on symptoms of people telling you what is, and so it's a very indefinite system. So you have to stick with it. I told you, I warned you, you mentioned San Francisco, and I want to mention something there, because I had a heartwarming, something really meant a lot to me. I was out in San Francisco. There's a place called the Hotel Empress there for homeless. And I was there and the director said, you should go talk to Mary over here. She's from one of the wealthiest families in this community. And she goes out every day and panhandles. And then she gives the money to us. Go ask her why. So I went out and I talked to her and she said, I panhandle because it's the only way people will talk to me. Imagine being so isolated that the only way you can get someone to talk to you is panhandling. I don't know how nice you guys are to panhandlers, but not exactly. So I'm going to interject that. Then I'm going to go back. I have spent a lot of time thinking about how do you approach someone with a mental illness. And on one end, there's the theory, if you just give them all these services, they'll eventually come around. And on the other end, there is, no, people are so sick, they lose insight, and you need to step in and force medicate if possible. And these are the constant arguments. My son had a family, he had social connectivity, he had a house, he had a doctor. And yet, I put him in hospitals 4 times. So, and every time he got out, he went off his meds. And no judge is going to give you an order to say you're on meds the rest of your life. So what is the answer? Well, the answer is trying to figure out how to engage him. How to get him to want to change. And that's the most difficult challenge of all. And people will tell you, they'll say, oh, let him hit rock bottom. What if that means death? So it's that fine balance a parent walks in with trying to partner, trying to listen, but also being wary and ready to step in if necessary. And it's a delicate dance. It's a very difficult dance.
I can
Sorry.
fix your microphone.
All right.
Wherever it went. You turned it off.
Oh, great.
Bad speaker.
That's all right. I kept all those people in Radio Land from asking me a question.
You got a question over there.
Yes.
Yes, sir. I was just wondering, in the course of your research, did you ever look into the immigrant community? Because I imagine the problems there are a great deal more severe because they might be afraid if they come forward, they might be picked up and deported.
Absolutely. You've stated it well. One of the problems that when I was doing my 10 months in the Miami jail, there was a tragic case where a person had been picked up who was an immigrant, and the federal government and the state and the county were all battling about who was going to pay for her. And so she had been in the jail almost 3 years. And because she wasn't a person who qualified for any kind of medical services and no one wanted to pay for them, they literally were just letting her in that cell all alone, feeding her but giving her absolutely no help. And it was one of the most tragic things I've ever seen. But not only immigrant, we need to be culturally aware. A lot of our programs are aimed at, white middle class folks. And that's good, but you also have to reach out and realize that there's differences in the minority communities and cultural differences. In the Asian community, there's a tremendous amount of shame of having a mental illness. And so you need to recognize those and try to address those problems. And that's a step for mental health folks to really realize and jump into.
Good afternoon. I'm a retired school teacher, and schools, especially public schools, are so underfunded. And the first group of people who are laid off are social workers. I know from Cleveland they have no social workers, and so many other districts in the country. So my question is, when you talk about mental illness and not catching it early, what would be your thoughts on maybe including that in your conversation or researching it? Because I'm sure there are so many young people who are left unattended because of the layoff of social workers.
Early intervention is key. The sooner, and here's the other thing, I was just talking about engagement. My son didn't resist the first time. And I start my story with a panic car ride, but a year earlier he'd been diagnosed. He had stopped eating. He didn't fight me about going to a psychiatrist. He wanted to know what was going on. But what did that psychiatrist say when he did that diagnosis? Psychiatrist, I'll get back to your question, I promise. The psychiatrist came out and he said, look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Your son's got bipolar disorder. You'd be luckier if he was on drugs. And I'm sitting there going like, what? He says, and I'm going to tell you the facts because this is a journey, it's a lifetime disease. Chances are you'll never get better. Every time you have a breakdown, you're going to kill more parts of your brain. You're going to be on medication all your life. and you probably have to go on disability to pay for your drugs, probably never work. Good luck getting married. I mean, it was like, whoa. Now, my wife recently was diagnosed with kidney cancer, okay? When we walked out of there, we came out like, man, we're going to beat the odds. This is highly treatable. We're going to be that different. Well, that's what my son did. In fact, my son walked out from the doctor. He looked at me and goes, that guy's crazy. Okay? So how do we engage this person? We don't tell them this. You give them no hope. You say, hey, welcome. We're going to help you. Early intervention. I was just yesterday at the Senate Summit about the bills up in Congress, and a psychiatrist there was talking about how infants, people 3, 4 years old, I guess those aren't infants, are seeing signs of mental illness. Teachers recognize that first. And a bill by Senator Murphy and Senator Cassidy would fund more money to early intervention. Schools, my wife's a teacher, you see it. And that's just part of it. The thing we have to realize in this country is the Perryman Group out of Texas did a study. For every dollar you spend on mental health treatment, you save $7 in the end. How do you save it? By not putting people in jails and prisons where they stay 3 times longer, cost 7 times more, and get turned out and then end up a week later back in the jail and prison. So the problem with that is getting politicians to buy into it and talking about cost avoidance. And people have trouble with that because everybody gets elected for 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, and they're sitting there going like, okay, this program over 10 years will save me all this. I'm not going to be around in 10 years, especially if I have to spend money now and raise taxes. I'm going to get thrown out immediately. So we have to rethink that. And that's what stepping up is all about, as Justice Stratton can tell you. It's about saving money by getting people out of the system. Bexar County, closed down a 1,000-bed jail. Miami's closing down jails. That's the key, one of the keys.
I just wanted to know, what advice do you have for parents that are dealing with a lot of the issues now that you had with your son as he was growing up?
Thank you very much. And I write about this on my blog, shameless plug. You can visit my blog at www.peterearley.com because I did everything wrong. And the first thing you got to realize is that this is not going to go away. It's not like, I'm not trying to be the doctor and say, woe is me, but it's serious. And it's not like you take aspirin and wake up in the morning and it's gone. The best thing to do is try to partner with your child. The next thing to do is educate yourself really, really well. You need to know, do you have CIT officers in your town? You need to know, do you have mental health courts? You need to know what rights you have in regards to getting information about that person. It's best if you have what's called an advance directive, but make sure you get the right kind. An advance directive is that, like my son says, I trust my dad. If I'm psychotic, he has the right to say what's necessary to be done. It's just like the same as if someone has dementia. You need to know if you have assisted outpatient treatment. That may require, if you have a history of going off your meds and a history of violence, that a judge can say, hey, you got to stay on this until you get better. You need to know if you have clubhouses. You need to be, best of all, here you go, you need to join NAMI. And I'll tell you why, because NAMI has family to family. I'm a lifetime member, and trust me, when I worked at the Washington Post, I didn't join anything because we were objective. I joined NAMI the first thing when I got out because I needed that support. They have family to family, which will help you. They'll come to you and say, okay, look, your son's doing this. Guess what? So did Mary and Bill, and here's how we handled it. And so those are some of my specifics. But most of all, you have to have hope. When my son was tasered, I followed him to the jail. He was laying there. He was tasered. He was hogtied. They were laughing at him. And I thought, it'd been better if he'd never been born. Now imagine that. And now look at him. 7 years, fantastic, doing great. And if he were here, you wouldn't even know he had a mental illness. So we're poor judges. So you got to hang in there.
I have a question about psychiatric beds in jails. It seems to me years ago experts agreed we had too many psychiatric beds, and so we closed. But now it seems to me we don't have enough psychiatric beds, so people are going to jail because there are no beds. And what do the experts say now? It seems like we're doing everything wrong. On the one hand, the mentally ill patient needs to be in a mental hospital, but we don't have a bed for him. We put him in jail, he gets corrupted by his environment, it comes out a criminal, if he wasn't to begin with. Seems to me we're screwing up both ends of the scale.
You've said it perfectly. Look, originally, let's go back and do a little quick history lesson. In colonial days, you had to depend on your family. You're locked up in jail, or the sheriff took you to Canada line and said, start walking, don't come back. 1843, Dorothea Dix was teaching a Bible class in Boston jail. And she went through a part of the jail that had no heat, and the people are literally freezing. And she went to the jailer and said, you can't treat people this way. He goes, oh no, you don't understand. Those people are lunatics. They don't feel the cold. They're not like you and me. Well, she spent the next 2 decades preaching that we needed treatment. And she personally persuaded 33 states to open up hospitals, which is what you're talking about. We opened up these state hospitals, and all of a sudden they were filled with thousands of, well, we all know what happened. They turned into giant warehouses where people often were abused and neglected. In Oklahoma, my home state, in 1963, they had a big expose, and they were worse than concentration camps. Well, Kennedy in '63 signed the Community Mental Health Act. Discovery of a new drug called Thorazine seemed to make it possible to move people out of these institutions back in the community. Well, what happened? Kennedy got assassinated, Vietnam War escalated, Congress got ensnarled in Watergate, Thorazine turned out not to be wonderful, and communities turned out not wanting these people, and so they never got funded. The $3 billion he asked for never got spent. The 2,000 centers never were opened. And then, if you check the history books, you'll find out that it really wasn't compassion and concern that led to the closing of those institutions. It was money. What happened was state legislators were being driven into a corner. They were saying, you got to fix these up. There were lawsuits. There was all class action suits because the mental health movement had carried over from the civil rights movement. They're saying, what are we going to do? And the legislators are going, oh my God, we're going to have to raise taxes. We can't do that. And then Uncle Sam came in and said, we'll take care of them. Don't worry. We'll take care of them, but only if they're not in that institution, and we're going to set up laws that you can't build any more than 16-bed facilities. We want them out. Well, Uncle Sam did as lousy a job as the counties did. And in fact, and you're very, very nonpartisan here, I'm just going to tell you the facts. In 1980, we sent Ronald Reagan to Washington, and we said, we're tired of Uncle Sam picking our pocket, cut the government. And he began cutting all the programs we just said we were going to spend to help these folks. 32 million, I think it is. No, 32 billion in housing was reduced down to 6 billion because we told him to. I'm not blaming Reagan, he just did it, all right? Then in 2008, as I said, states started cutting again. So I really appreciate your question because we have never adequately funded any of these things. And right now, it's gotten worse. We have psychiatric boarding. What's that? I was just in California. You have somebody, you go to an emergency room, you take your child in, you can wait a minimum of 18 hours, sometimes up to 3 days trying to get a hospital bed because there are no crisis care beds available. Why aren't there? Well, there's a couple reasons. One is HMOs. Initially, they were going to save us all. 2005, I think 3/4 of them were for-profit. Psychiatric beds don't make money. Surgical beds do. And so they began in 2005 in Northern Virginia, they closed down half those beds. And you're going to see it happening all over, and hospitals too. They got to make money. So they're constantly balancing, okay, how many surgical beds do we have and how many psychiatric beds, which are going to cost us money? You know, everybody knows about Virginia State Senator Craig Deeds, right? And how he took his son in, and there were no beds. There were no beds. And his son went home, and his son attacked him and then killed himself. That shows the problem. But let me go beyond that. Do you know that should not have surprised anybody who was paying attention in Virginia? Because 2 years earlier, our state inspector general had said that hospitals were turning 200 people a month away from their facilities who met the dangerous criteria because there were no beds. They called it streeting. Now here's the other part of that. The day that Craig Deeds took his son there were 150 people in the state hospitals who had reached their maximum potential. They were ready for discharge, but there was no place to send them in the community. There was no housing. And so they had bottlenecked the system. And that's what you have to see and what stepping up is part of. And what you need to see here in Ohio, as Justice Stratton can tell you, it's not just, oh, let's fix CIT or let's make a mental health court. You have to look at the whole spectrum. And that includes housing and all those other things. So I talked long enough. I think you forgot your question, but thank you.
Mr. Earley, thank you very much for your compliments about the state of Ohio and Cuyahoga County in particular. We've worked hard in this community to be a leader in mental health services. My question to you is, well, recently in our county, we have established a faith-based committee.
Good for you.
Where we're emphasizing the importance of spirituality in the recovery process. We're excited about it. We know that it's going to make the difference in the lives of our consumers. I would like to hear your opinion about faith and spirituality in the recovery process. And I could not end my statement without saying, because of the leadership of our CEO, Mr. Bill Dennehan, this is why we're doing so well in this county.
Good. Let me try 2 points here. First is, when somebody has a mental breakdown, one of the first persons they call is their family doctor. The number 2 person that gets called is their minister. And ministers are even poorer equipped than family doctors are when it comes to mental health. Most family doctors don't know anything about mental health. And ministers also have religion tied into it, and depending on their faith and denomination, that all plays a role in it. And they're very poorly handled. So again, we're talking about engagement. How do you get people? I am thrilled. I wish more faith-based groups would get involved because the audience, and more importantly, they could really help fight stigma. If churches every Sunday during Mental Health Month got up there and said, look, I can do this right here. I can tell you that in this audience right now, there are people who have a much worse story to tell than I ever did. And there are people right in this audience who have a brother or a sister or even them have a mental health diagnosis. So in a church it's the same way if 1 in 5. Now, you're asking me about faith. I think that depends on the individual. We know that Alcoholics Anonymous, we know all of these have a higher power, and they dilute it, so they don't say it has to be Jesus or it has to be Buddha or whatever. It's the idea that you have to think beyond yourself. You had to realize that you are helpless. I see it with my son a different way. He had to accept that he was ill. And that was the only time then we could move forward, because acceptance then leads to actually wanting to do something to fix it. As long as you're saying, I'm not mentally ill, I'm not one of those people, it's very hard to get somebody engaged. So I think, I'm religious. I grew up in a religious family, so obviously I have my own spiritual. I think it's helpful, but I also have family members who have alcohol problems, and they're totally turned off by religion. And so I think it's you had to address the person where they are. I'll try to make shorter answers, get more questions here.
Hi, I work in one of our region's state psychiatric hospitals, and we actually have your book on the shelves of our hospital, in our patient library. So I'm putting on my Stonecatcher hat. And what some of our patients want to know, and you touched on it briefly in a previous question, is that bottleneck experience. People who feel they've reached their potential, people who feel like they're ready for the next step, possibly because of their charges or having like an NGRI status, they feel stuck. Right. And they don't know where to go next. So they want to know, I'm asking on their behalf, what advice do you have for them to get to the next step? More specifically, aside from NAMI, are there any other organizations that you're aware of that are really working to help people sort of navigate this process?
Yeah. Look up the Corporation for Supportive Housing. I happen to be on the board. Justice Stratton used to be on the board. And they have a lot of reentry programs there that are designed specifically like that to help people with housing. One of the problems you run into if you're caught in the criminal justice system is nobody ever wants to let you out because they're afraid. And that's why they spend, 3 to 7 times longer in a facility. And no judge wants to take the risk of putting his name on an early discharge or a discharge because he's afraid something might happen. So you have to go beyond that. And the way you go beyond that is by setting up a reentry system where people just aren't thrown out the door, where they have a case manager, they have a case plan, they have people checking on them, and they help them make that transition. And that's where you have to work with law enforcement and also your community to set up housing, not in the slums, not where people are using drugs and right back in an environment that's going to be hard for them to overcome, but in a place that's going to help uplift them, connections to clubhouses. But you have to have, if you then have that plan, if you can go and say, hey, look, we want to release Pete, and he's going to go in this housing, he's going to be seen by this person, he's on his meds, he's done this, if that's what the answer is, then you're going to be able to do that. But that's tough because it all goes back to money and getting that kind of support. Look for a really progressive judge. Look at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. They have a reentry program guide there that might be useful. And they're big in Ohio, aren't they? Aren't they, Justice Stratton? Yeah, Corporation for Supportive, yeah. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry.
Mr. Earley, thanks again. That was very powerful. I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Thank you.
I currently serve as the medical director for our county jail, and we're continuing to build more successes with this idea of the reentry programs, and it's absolutely vital. But my background for 25 years was emergency medicine. In fact, years ago I worked in Fairfax, in the emergency department there. Crazy busy.
Yeah.
And across the country, emergency departments have become everybody's safety net.
Right.
And everybody gets sent there. And you can see how wrong this works for these kind of patients. Fortunately, in this city, we actually have an emergency department focused on just behavioral health emergencies, and St. Vincent's Charity, and they do a wonderful job. My question is, have any of the rules or laws or approaches in emergency departments in Virginia changed since what you dealt with your son? Or are you still going to face that same kind of reproach when you go in there with that kind of a behavioral health emergency?
Well, it's trying to change attitudes, but what you'll see in the most successful communities is, and look, emergency rooms can't turn people away, and neither can jails. And so that's why they become the dumping grounds. So what you're going to see in Bexar County, Texas, San Antonio, they have a crisis drop-off center. Those are picking up steam. Miami, it's the same place. Try to get them away from both the emergency room, away from the jail, into a facility where you can be properly diagnosed and funneled then into the right services. And so that is kind of the goal, and we're trying to do that in Virginia. But we're also, you need to talk about a mind shift here. And it's a mind shift. You know, I just told you about how bad things were in Miami. Miami has been working hard to change that. And Judge Leithman said, you need to get down here because I'm tired of hearing your speech. And so I went down there, and last week they had 50,000 calls related to mental health last year. They have gotten CIT so well tuned down there, they only made 109 arrests. And he said it's a matter of pride now that if an officer gets spit on, he doesn't charge him with assault. Even if an officer gets pushed, he doesn't charge him with assault because it's a matter of pride. I'm going to get this person help. That's a cultural shift. That's amazing. And that's what you have to, that's what your goals should be, you know, trying to get that in both EMT. And, you know, emergency rooms, I think most emergency rooms that I've dealt with don't want them there. And low priority, not going to make any money, so let's just sit them in the corner and hopefully they'll leave. And that's what happened to me. Yeah.
Pete, thanks for an extraordinary mission today. I appreciate what you've done and what you'll probably continue to do to raise our consciousness. I serve as an administrator in the business side, and I've seen a change of treatment versus incarceration, and we have the leverage. You want treatment or you want to go to jail? Right. That works, but it only works best when you have the capacity, talking about the rooms and housing and jobs when people get out of prison. So the problem that I see is the lack of funding. And it goes back to what the gentleman man in the past. Well, we had them in jail in the 60s, let them out of jail, let them out of the hospitals. Now they're in jail. I think that I would like to hear your viewpoint of what is the next step to get to where your son's at, because we have all the steps to get there, but I don't think we had that final step. The final thing is that I was taught a lesson myself. I thought I knew a little bit about the community, and was with a group of people that says, 5% of the people we're treating cost 80% of the funding. And I called them, the frequent flyers.
Right.
And a doctor in the audience says, we shouldn't be doing that. It's a failure of the system, not their failure first. And I think we've got to recognize that it's we have failed to properly treat them. And to call them frequent flyers is not the way to do it. Right. And until we get to that 5% and figure out the lack of capacity, instead of talking about all these other things, I'd like to hear your comments on that to make all of us where your son's at today.
Well, you've asked me several questions. You're right, it's about 5% cost, about 50% of services. It's the old $1 Million Murray, if you're familiar with that story, where they followed a guy in New York years ago and they ended up costing $1 million in services. We're lucky in law enforcement because we actually can prove in most cases it's cheaper to provide housing, et cetera. There's a real confusion here when it comes to money. You go out in the street and there is no money. And people have just cut. Yet we spend $200 billion a year on mental health in this country. California had just had the millionaire's tax. They got $1 billion. And their services aren't much better than ours. So it's what is going on here? Is it not getting to them? Is it what? Senators Murphy and Cassidy have a new bill that they've introduced trying to get more money into the kind of services. We need to Tim Murphy is trying to redirect SAMHSA so they focus more, trying to get evidence-based, trying to look, supporters of AOT are saying that this assisted outpatient treatment is what's necessary to help this hardcore group of folks who never get better. They're always homeless, they're always sick. So those are some of the kind of tools that, people are looking at. I think we need to think outside the box a little, and we have to realize that this is a community problem. Let me give you an example. Emergency room doctors say, we don't have any money. Okay, well, under the Affordable Care Act, hospitals were fined $468 million last year for frequent utilizers, people who they were supposed to treat and then ended up coming back a few months later. All right, who are the biggest folks in that group? It's our group. All right, well then think outside of putting a pill in someone's mouth. Why don't you build housing? Why don't you help build, somewhere for these folks to go so they can get help? You have to get the community involved and recognize it's that problem. And then you can also get real cute and do what I did in Virginia, which got me absolutely nowhere, which is say, hey, we had the lowest cigarette tax in the nation. If we raised it 10 cents, we'd raise X amount of money. And that, of course, immediately got shut down. So, but look for innovative ways. Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Great job.
Appreciate it.
Great job. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, in recognition of Mental Health Awareness Month, we've been enjoying a Friday forum with Pete Earley, author and mental health advocate. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you very much, Mr. Earley. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and our listening and broadcast audience. Our forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskind Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.